we have the pleasure of having Professor Axel Gosseries as a speaker today. He is Professor of Philosophy from the University of Louvain in Belgium. And secondly, the topic of the talk today is quite topical after the elections in Georgia a few days ago, where justice was a big issue, more or less. So Professor Gosseries enjoyed staying in Tbilisi so far in Georgia. He has been to a few places, including bird watching, but he also gave great seminars on different aspects of justice, including libertarian and egalitarian theories. And now today we are here to listen to his thoughts on justice in politics. So you are very welcome, and this floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So George asked me to present some ideas about justice in politics. And so I gathered some thoughts, a patchwork of 6 main ideas that I'm going to share with you. And please feel free to interrupt me anytime if you have questions or comments or disagreements, or if you think it's totally irrelevant when you compare this to the elections you've just had. So I'm going to look at the idea of justice in politics through the angle of normative political theory or political philosophy. And one of the things I'm going to try to do is to articulate the idea of democracy and the idea of justice. So distributive justice being the heart of justice, but not the only part of justice. And so as I said, I'm going to do that in 6 steps, so there will be just 6 ideas that we can discuss. So the first idea is democracy and justice. There are 2 ways of articulating the 2 things. Let's say there's the proceduralist way and the substantivist way. So what are proceduralists typically going to say? They're going to say a policy is fair if it's the outcome of a fair actual procedure. So there's a very close connection between justice and legitimacy. And to some extent, there is a confusion of the 2, right? For that vision of justice and legitimacy. In contrast, the substantivists are going to say, no, a fair procedure is neither a sufficient nor a necessary condition for identifying a fair policy option. So it's not sufficient, right? So you can have, the idea is that you can have a perfectly democratic procedure that leads you to bad policy options, bad policy choices, unfair policy choices. It's also not necessary. You can say, we can, if we just discuss by ourselves, it's not really a democracy because we're not representative, or we've not been elected and so on, but we could come up with the right policy option if we were discussing together. Right? So it's neither sufficient nor necessary. And so that's the first contrast. And this gives you one way of articulating democracy and justice. So justice is either defined as the outcome of a fair procedure, a just policy choice, or justice is independent from democracy. Right? And then you have a situation analogous to what you have to some extent in physics, where you have two areas, and there is no clear integration of the 2. Right? So one of the questions is, how do you integrate justice and democracy? A few more comments on that. There's an ambiguity with the idea of procedure, because you could say, well, for substantivists as well, in some sense, in order to say that your position is justified, you should go through a hypothetical procedure, such as the veil of ignorance, the original position, reflective equilibrium for Rawlsians, just to take an example. And also, if you look at libertarianism, you can say that these theories are to some extent procedural as well, in the sense that to some extent they would say your entitlement, you are the legitimate owner of that good if you got it from someone else and so on. So the word procedure is quite broad. And so here, when I refer to proceduralist, I refer to a fair actual procedure as the one we are used to in a democracy. Another point is that for proceduralists, whenever there's something wrong going on, the only thing you can do is to try and trace it back to the procedure and say, if there's something wrong with that policy, there needs to be something wrong in the procedure. So, for example, if you say Hitler was democratically elected and so on, he took the wrong policies and so on, so there must be something wrong. It was not democratic. So, in a way, substantivists and proceduralists are going to try and diagnose the problems differently. And a final point on that articulation between democracy and justice is that for substantivists, it is better to use a narrow notion of democracy, namely the rule of law, election procedures, parliamentary action, the interaction between parliament and the executive, and so on, plus a few political fundamental rights. But not a broad notion as the one we tend to use when you say we are Democrats, and we tend to include in that a full theory of justice. Right? If you have that broad notion of democracy, then there's no way, pedagogically if you want, to start to think about the articulation between democracy and justice. Right? So in order to be able to think about that, you need to use a narrow notion of democracy. But very often in the general public, when you say this is not democratic, we mean a lot of things. For example, access to education. We say we want to democratize access to education. That's a broad sense of democracy. Make it accessible to all. So in what follows, I'm going to use it narrowly, democracy. Not because I think this is the right sense, but this is a meaning of democracy that allows you to think about the articulation between justice and democracy. So that was the first point. There are 6. The second point is what makes democracy valuable? And how does justice play a role here? So typically, as it often happens in philosophy, you'll have 2 families of defense, the intrinsic defense and the instrumental defense of democracy. Of course, philosophers are always tempted to say there's something of intrinsic value in democracy. And it also looks far less glorious to say that the value of democracy is more instrumental. The methodological difficulty is that it's always easier to show that something has instrumental value because you can say, well, this is good because of that. Right? Somehow, if the value is intrinsic, there's not much you can say. Right? So it's more difficult to argue for the intrinsic value of something. Like if you say a bird has an intrinsic value, it's just a claim and there's not much more you can say about it. Whereas if you can say a bird has an instrumental value because it kills insects that would endanger the crop production and so on, of course, it looks much more like an argument than a claim. But in terms of democracy, many people believe that democracy is mainly good for instrumental reasons. And they will provide a set of reasons. One is democracy provides a better guarantee for peace. Democracy provides a better guarantee for efficiency and to some extent growth. Or democracy provides a better guarantee to have fair decisions of justice. So although we might say it's neither necessary nor sufficient to have following a fair procedure is neither necessary nor sufficient, we could still hold the view that, in general, a democracy tends to lead to better decisions in terms of fairness. An example of the peace justification is the Schumpeterian justification. That is, there's a nice article by Adam Przeworski on that. And he says, you know, democracy is better than a lottery. Because you could make sure you have you alternate people, you don't have always Saakashvili, but sometimes you have Ivanishvili, then Saakashvili again, and so on. You could do that through a lottery, right? Because there's a 50% chance that it's going to change. But if you do that through democracy, it's much better. And why is it better? Because you get the figures. So you get the figures about how many people are against you, right, if you stay in power. Or how many people would be against you if you want to contest the outcome of the elections. That provides a better guarantee for peace, because if you find out that there are 80% of the population that is against you, and you want to stick to power, you're less likely to do it, because you're going to realize there's a lot to be done if you want to stay in power against 80% of the population. So that's why democracy provides a better guarantee for peace than just a lottery. This is just an example. So, how we justify democracy, why we find it valuable. There can be intrinsic justification, intrinsic value in it, there can be extrinsic or instrumental value to it. And so, in the end, it's important to distinguish different views. One that says democracy is just a fair procedure. Another one that says democracy serves justice, distributive justice, for example. And that's why it's valuable. And there's still another view that says that democracy is part of justice. It's one dimension of justice, namely the fair allocation of power, in the same way as we have the fair allocation of healthcare access, or the fair allocation of access to education, access to natural resources, and so on. We also have the fair sharing of power. That would be democracy. We'll come back to it. So different ways, as you can see, of articulating democracy and justice. That was the second idea. Now let's come to the third idea. We can try and find out why we think democracy is valuable, and then we can go more into detail and try and find out two things. What we find valuable in democracy, what is exactly this thing or the set of things that we find valuable in a democracy, and how should we design specific democratic dimensions. So I'll go into that briefly. First, what do we value in democracy? Many people will say strict majority rule is a very important component of democracy. And I believe it is. And we'll come back to it later. But other people say, well, even if we didn't have a strict majority rule, that's just a decision rule. It's not enough. There's much more in democracy. And one other component is deliberation. Because what's valuable in the democracy is that we can deliberate rather than bargaining. And deliberation is important because it consists in an exchange of reasons. And the idea of deliberation is that we can learn together to take better decisions. Right? So it's not just about majority, it's also about deliberation. And maybe for some defenders of deliberative democracy, deliberation is much more important than majority rule. So it's not just about sharing power, but it's about producing decisions together. That's much more valuable for those who defend deliberation as central. Participation is also important. Right? You can say there's majority rule, there's deliberation, there's participation. And then there are other things like the rule of law that you don't only have in democracies, you can have in despotic regimes, the rule of law to some extent. And separation of powers is also important. So I think that what we need to keep in mind is that democracy is a set of things, right? And we'll come back to it later as well. That you cannot just, from the analysis of the concept, derive an essential definition of democracy. We refer to democracy, and in fact, with the idea of democracy, we have to define it and identify the set of components that we find central. So there can be majority rule, deliberation, participation, rule of law, separation of power, and other things. So it's a complex idea. Now, so this is general, and then we can go more into detail and try and find out how we can possibly design the specific institutions of our democracy. And how can we do that in a fair way? The connection with justice. I'll give you two examples. There is a small literature that is growing now on the demos. How do we circumscribe the demos of a democracy? So we can say, well, when we know who should be included, then we can decide whether we want majority rule or whether we want counter-majoritarian mechanism or supermajority requirements and so on. But there's a prior decision, which is who do we include in the demos? Right? Take Georgia. If I ask you, okay, who should have the right to vote in Georgia? What do you think? For example, should Belgium from Brussels have some say in deciding about the planning of some neighborhoods of Tbilisi?
The amendment in constitution, so Georgians Georgians were citizens of the EU countries. They have voting power.
Oh, but they are also Georgians or not?
They are native Georgians, but are citizens of the European countries.
So we had that debate actually, who should
Okay.
vote and who should not.
Okay, and you also have foreigners who live here, residents. They also have the right to vote in local elections?
No.
So these are issues that are important, and you have to see, philosophically it's quite interesting. One of the aspects is that there cannot be a democratic way of deciding about what the demos should do. Because it's completely circular, right? So that's why you need independent arguments. That's why a purely procedural approach to the issue is impossible. If I ask you, okay, should those who are not included vote and so on, and we start with any kind of starting point, like who can vote today, right? It's going to be completely arbitrary what the outcome is going to be, to some extent. There's no reason to start with this starting point and not with a broader demos and ask them who should be included. And another philosophical challenge there is there's one of the principles that is proposed, the all-affected principle. Imagine two policy options, A and B, and if you adopt A, it's going to be this million people who is going to be very much affected. And if you have policy B, it's going to be another group of people who is going to be very much affected. And then the question is, when you have to choose between A and B, who should be included? And there's a real challenge there, because if you think, well, we should include all those who are potentially affected by the decision, then potentially it's very, very inclusive what you have to include. So there's some discussion on that. And what you need to see is that the concept of democracy or a purely democratic decision procedure doesn't give you the answer to who should be included in the demos. So you need some substantive reason to find out. So there you can see that there's a connection with justice too. Another example is transparency of deliberation. Another example of specific questions you need to ask that you're not going to find the answer in the concept of democracy, whatever it means. That's an interesting example, because if I ask you, are you very attached to transparency? If you raise your hand, who is going to say yes? Are you very attached to transparency? Do you think transparency is something important?
We raised that way.
And at the same time, you realize that one of the very basic components of a democracy, which is the vote, is secret. You also realize that in many other areas, there are things that you find very important that remain secret, for example, your privacy. Right? So at the political or non-political the political and non-political level, there are things that you think should be secret. And one interesting question is, should deliberation be secret or transparent, for example, in parliament? And there is some literature on that. I mean, the difficulty is always, of course, that when you look at secrecy questions, you don't have a lot of data. So we don't have, but we have some data, some interesting data that show that actually when deliberation is made public, you have a set of phenomena. One phenomenon, one thing that happens is that you get less conformity to the position of dominant people. Okay? So, for example, if you have a dominant person who has, for example, a lot of legitimacy towards the outside, or who is scaring off everyone, right? Then if deliberation is public, people are not going to dare disagree. They are not going to dare presenting alternative views, right? Because they are scared of being ridiculous. And so there's data from the Fed Bank, a very interesting data set where they had two periods. One period in which the minutes were written with the idea that they would always remain secret. And the second period, the minutes were written with the knowledge that they would become public. And so in the end, they got both sets of minutes public, right? And so they could compare what was going on with the impact of publicity on deliberation. And so the two kind of outcomes they got is first, so that was in the Fed Bank, there was Alan Greenspan. They discovered that there was less gap between the different positions and the position of Alan Greenspan. Right? So less diversity, so less input, less ideas being shared. Right? So if you want a poor deliberation. Right? And the other kind of aspect kind of effect we find of public deliberation is that when you state your position, it's very difficult afterwards to state a different position. But if you think about deliberation, the very point of deliberation is to allow you, and sometimes to force you to change your mind. And so there is something intrinsically contradictory in the idea of a public deliberation to that extent, because you can say, well, in fact, publicity kills deliberation, or kills what we find valuable in the deliberation, which is the possibility of changing your mind and changing people's idea on things. Right? So these are just two examples of design questions within democracy, right, that raise in part questions of fairness. Right? Certainly how you circumscribe the demos and access to power and so on. That's certainly an issue of justice. Right? And so these are the kind of challenges we are facing. So that was the third idea. The fourth idea is majority rule. Right? There's a clear connection between the idea of justice and the idea of strict majority. And probably you can say that everything else equal, strict majority is the rule that provides you the best account of, or the best translation of the idea of equal weight. If you require supermajority, in fact, there's something unfair, because you give too much weight to minority people in the supermajority decision. Right? So that as soon as you move away from strict majority, there is something unfair. Everything else equal. Now, in terms of fairness, things turn out to be more complex, because if you take the all affected principle, and you can show that some people are more affected by decisions than others, right? Then you could say, then there is a reason for moving away from strict majority and having, for example, proportional right to vote. This is what we have indirectly through decentralization, in fact. BDC people have a lot more to say about BDC planning than Tel Aviv people. Right? So in a certain way, it is a form of proportional. So the question is, to what extent can we say that strict majority is the fairest rule? Right? Everything else equal, you could say yes. But then when you start looking at the differential impact that decisions have on people, maybe you could say moving away from strict majority is fair. Right? And then you could defend proportional voting. For example, what you have in firms with shareholders. In a certain sense, you could say the fact that some shareholders have more vote because they have more shares is fair, because they are more affected, right? It's different, whether you can lose 100 or 1,000, of course, affects you differently. So you could say that's why maybe shareholders, this is right that shareholders have more right to vote when they have more shares. At the same time, in a democracy like ours, you would say, right, but should it follow that people who have more houses or more money should have an extra right to vote in the state, right? It doesn't really follow, right? So we have to think about this, about to what extent there's a connection between strict majority and the idea of fairness, or an equal right to vote. Now, if we take strict majority as a starting point, we can see that there are a lot of counter-majoritarian mechanisms in a democracy. Right? So there are a lot of what we call veto points. There's a very nice paper by Jan Shapiro that is called "Why Don't the Poor Soak the Rich?" And the question is, how comes that in democracy where you have a majority of very poor people, they still don't vote for the left, or they still don't manage to get very left-wing policy? Right? So imagine you have 80% very poor people, and they still don't manage to get a left-wing government. Right? And the explanation, part of the explanation, there is a whole set of explanations, but part of the explanation is that democracies have a whole set of veto points, right? Separation of power, there are constitutional restrictions, there's freedom of movement for the rich, there are all sorts of things. Right? So one interesting question that is related to fairness is you start with the idea of strict majority as a potential candidate for fair allocation rule of power, and then you look at all the counter-majoritarian or the super-majoritarian rules we have, and you ask yourself, don't we have good reasons to depart from strict majority? And then you need to build all these arguments independently, right? I give you an example here, which is constitutional rigidity. So as you probably know, some constitutions are not rigid, like the New Zealand constitution, it's a constitution, but you can change it through just simple majority, right? There's no rigidity. But very often, in most countries that have a constitution, we are attached to the fact that it's rigid. Namely, it needs you need to follow a whole set of procedures to change it, right? So it's not so easy to change. So Jefferson, we talked about Jefferson yesterday. One of the ideas of Jefferson was that there's something unfair with constitutional rigidity. Right? And to grasp what is unfair with it, you can compare it with the situation of Georgia and Russia. Right? And if you compare two generations and two countries, right? So you have a generation that adopts the constitution, and then the next generation is stuck with it, right? Or it's very hard for it to change. And it's a little bit like if Georgia were to adopt a constitution and declare that Russia should also follow the same constitution. So one question is, what's the problem with constitutional rigidity? So what's the diagnosis? Why is there something unfair with constitutional rigidity? So there are several possible diagnoses. One of them says it violates the rule of majority voting. And the idea is, look, you have this single generation that adopts this constitution. Then all the other following generations need to follow it, right? So the problem is that it's a minority that decides for a majority. Right? So the diagnosis is that constitutional rigidity, the problem with it has to do with the violation of the majority. I think that the problem is actually different from that. The problem is a problem of the sovereignty. And to understand it, I give you the following example. You have a generation that has 80 people, and they decide to procreate very little. For example, because they want to emphasize quality rather than quantity, or because they are concerned about the environment, or whatever reason. Right? So you have 80 people in the first generation, 20 people in the second generation. The first generation adopts a constitution and requires to change the constitution a 2/3 majority. And in that case, of course, there's more than a 2/3 majority within the first generation that adopts it. Right? So you could say, well, in that case, it's clear that if there is still a problem with constitutional rigidity, it cannot be because of a minority imposing a decision on a majority, because the 2/3 majority within this first generation of 80 people is much larger than the full amount of people of the second generation. So what is the nature of the problem then? It's not a majority problem. It's a problem of sovereignty. It's the fact that one group is going to adopt a constitution and impose some rules on another group without being subject to it in the second period. Right? And so, in a way, they violate the sovereignty of the next generation in the same way as if we had, for example, Russia, the first generation, adopting a constitution and claiming that it should be imposed both on Russia and on Georgia. Okay? So to come back to this fourth idea, the question is to what extent strict majority is a requirement of justice, and to what extent do we have good reasons to depart from strict majority and to adopt supermajoritarian or counter-majoritarian policies. And for example, constitutional rigidity is an example of such a policy. And if you analyze it in terms of fairness or justice, you can say, first, there's something unfair to it, and then you try to diagnose what's wrong. It is not especially the fact that it's minority imposing something on a majority. It's rather the fact that it's violating the sovereignty of each generation. Right? It's one sovereign generation imposing things on the next sovereign generation. And then the third step in the reasoning about constitutional rigidity consists in asking, but still, don't we have good reasons to accept that rigidity? Then you need to find out reasons here of an intergenerational type to say, well, yes, constitutional rigidity violates generational sovereignty, right? So to that extent it's unfair. But there may be good reasons to have that. For example, you say, if you have a 3 generations model, you can say, generation 1 violates the sovereignty of generation 2. But actually that may be good, because it restricts the scope of action of generation 2, and to that extent protects generation 3, and maybe 4, maybe 5, maybe 6. So the fact of restricting sovereignty may actually serve the generations that come after. That's one kind of possible justification for restricting sovereignty. Right? So we start with the idea of majority as a fair rule, then we look at counter or supermajoritarian restrictions, and what we need to do as political theorists is find out justifications for each of these things, right? Separation of power, constitutional rigidity, and also find out more generally whether we think that strict majority is actually fair. For example, as I said, if you believe that people are unequally affected by policies, you could say from the start that strict majority is not very often the fairest rule. That we may be actually adopting this rule for practical reasons, but that philosophically it's not that strong. It's not maybe the best translation of equal respect for each individual. Let's move to the fifth idea. Justice is not only about institutions, it's also about the ethos of people. And I think that you can have the best institutions, but they will be unable to deliver a fair society if individual people don't have proper ethos, or minimum ethos, minimum democratic ethos. So when you try to look at justice in politics, it's not only about the design of the institutions, it's also about the individual ethics of the actors. And you can ask questions about each of them. And here are 2 examples. Voters, the ethics of voters. So what's the social responsibility that we have as electors when we go and vote? We have a social responsibility. Voting is a public act. Voting is made in secret, but as you're probably aware, at the time of John Stuart Mill, James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham, there was a huge discussion. They even had a journal as to whether the vote should be secret. Because before the expansion of the franchise, it was not secret. And they found it perfectly normal because they thought we are accountable, we have to be held accountable for our decisions. So when we vote, if we vote for Ivanishvili or if we vote for Saakashvili, we should be able to tell our neighbor who is going to be affected by it why we did so. Right? So voting is a public action. There were practical reasons why they decided that even if it's lesser evil, but it is an evil, they thought it's a lesser evil to make the vote secret, and the main reason at that time was that workers feared that their employers would generate problems if the vote was not secret. And I've heard from even recent Georgian experience that the problem of secrecy of vote is not an old problem, it's still a problem today, right? And but so the idea there is that the secrecy of vote is supposed to guarantee something, right? So what is that something? What are voters expected to do? Right? So we have different questions about the ethics of voters. One is whether we have a duty to go and vote whenever the vote is not compulsory. Do we have a duty to vote? There's some literature on that. And the second question is, when we go and vote, what should we aim at? Right? There are different things you can do. You can say, well, when I go and vote, I just elect the person who best fits my interests. Right? And that's perfectly fair. Or you can say, no, not at all. When you go and vote, you should go and defend your view about the general interest. Okay? What corresponds to your view about the general interest and not about your personal interest. That's very different. Or you could also say, well, the ethics of voters consist in getting informed, discussing with people before the elections and so on, and trying to test our view about the general interest and make sure it's the right view by discussing with others before going to vote. And that's still a different approach. And then the same questions arise for representatives. What's the ethos of the representative? What's the social responsibility of a representative? Right? Should he vote for his personal interests? Should he vote for the interest of those very people who elected him? For example, only the people from Kakhètia or only the Adjari people because most of my electorate is in Adjaria? Or should they vote for the collective interest of all Georgians? Or should they make sure that they deliberate properly among themselves in the parliament in order to reach a type of decision, a type of account of the general interests that is more mature, if you want, than the prior idea they had about what the general interest was. So all these questions are crucial, and so there's a clear distinction to be made between what voters or what representatives or what any other function are legally allowed to do, right? And what they should do in order for democracy to work in a fair way. So the claim here is that you can have the best institution, but they won't deliver any fair outcomes if you don't have also an ethos of people. Okay? And in some countries, it requires a lot of courage, and it also requires some degree of trust. Right? And because if you're completely cynical, there's no change you can expect. So let's move then to the sixth point. If you care about justice in politics, then you can also ask yourself, do we need theories of justice in politics? Right? Do we need politicians to use theories of justice? And you could start with the idea that, well, in fact, sometimes ambiguous claims and not very precise claims and so on are better because they help reaching agreement. But the claim here is that if you want a mature and adult democracy, I think some degree of explicitness is required. You cannot just always move in the realm of ambiguous claims. And at some point you need to go explicit and to be clear about your priorities and so on. And if you want to be clear about priorities, you need to go beyond slogans. You need to go beyond this slogans such as justice versus freedom, or I'm in favor of freedom, efficiency first, or whatever. Right? You need a minimally rich theory that provides you an account of, a general account and a relatively complete account of what the priorities are. If you want, the idea is a bit similar to the reasons why we can be skeptical about single-issue parties. Do you have single-issue parties in Georgia?
Yes, we do. We have Greens Party.
Okay.
But
Green parties are not considered anymore like single-issue parties, but they are, okay. But for example, the party of the pensioners, or the party of the hunters, or the party of the pirates, or the party of the animal lovers, or whatever. And we are skeptical about these because they provide an incomplete vision of things, and they don't make the effort of course they make priorities. They say, well, the single issue is the priority over everything else, right? But they don't really make the effort of saying, okay, we have a limited budget, we have to provide for this, and that. What are the principles we're going to follow? This is the general problem with a single issue party. And by analogy, you could say, well, what we get from a theory of justice is precisely such an account. We get a comprehensive, or relatively comprehensive or general account of what justice requires. Right? So you specify what you mean by freedom, how you translate your concern for freedom, you specify what you mean by equality, you specify this, and you also tell us how much weight you give to efficiency, how you understand security or safety, and responsibility, and so on. And I think that it's very important to try and instill within democratic debate the vision that we have through theories of justice. Because this provides you ways of having principled decisions. And philosophers believe that there's a connection between the principled nature of our decisions and the fair nature of our decisions. So the idea would be that although having principled decision-making is not a sufficient condition for fairness, it would be a necessary condition for having general principles. Because this is a condition for accountability. We are able to justify why we take such and such a decision, and why it's compatible with the other decisions we take in other fields. So to conclude on justice in politics, I would say a fair procedure is not enough, contrary to what proceduralists claim. A fair procedure is probably necessary, but it certainly requires substantive thinking about the design, detailed design. Strict majority is one dimension of fairness, but there are probably a whole set of reasons to depart from it, and good reasons. There's no justice in politics without an ethos that is also concerned about justice. And I don't think there can be justice in politics in realistic conditions without relying on an articulate theory of justice, without politicians, without citizens having some sense of articulated theories of justice. That's what I would have to say as a philosopher on justice in politics. Thank you.
Do you really believe that the principal decisions and clarity about what justice represents in society theoretically contributes to actual just policies, or contributes to democracy?
Is that a factual question or a normative question?
It's a factual question. Or
so
you could just
yeah, when I present
theories
theories of justice to my law students, who are then going to become judges and so on, I have the sense that they are not very familiar with that kind of thinking, that the law studies push them towards, yeah, you need to be case specific and so on, and all these cases are different. And so to some extent, they agree with the fact that we need principled decisions because they agree that there is a constitution, there is a constitutional court, the law needs to be general, apply to all citizens, there is equality before the law. So to some extent they accept this, but to another extent, I often have the feeling that it doesn't go very far for them. Right? But I think that if you have a constitutional court, for example, in the framing of the decisions, they will always frame it slightly ambiguously to preserve their freedom to decide differently in the future. But at the same time, they accept the idea that their decision should be principled. Namely, that they couldn't depart from a previous decision without any good reasons. Of course, they are going to be super concise. All courts do that in order to preserve their freedom as courts, right? But at the same time, I think that they accept the idea that the decision should be principled. That there are trends and that, okay, there's a dominant trend which is this, and of course then we can later depart from it if the case is different and so on. So that's how I would see it. So at the same time they accept the idea, but in the way they express it, very often when you look at these court decisions, they're very short, or they use always the same expression to look like nothing's going on.
I have many questions, but I will limit myself to two major ones. First is you have mentioned why democracy doesn't, especially in poor society, doesn't ensure that left-wing parties are not elected. And I would like you to follow up maybe about medium voters hypothesis. I mean, there is like different divergence in empirical evidence whether that hypothesis holds or not. But I mean, still we can see in some countries that maybe not left-wing parties are elected, but elections lead to more distribution. And in this case, well, they may ensure justice in some way. And another question is, well, this is a normative question, because you have, by talking about justice in politics, you have talked about democracy mainly. And I would like you to follow up about the debates. If you think like the democracy is the best way, best political order to meet justice in politics, not in like factual, like not on evidence-based examples, but what philosophy, what political philosophy tells about this. Thank you.
Well, these are difficult questions, so I'll be short. So the question that Shapiro was asking was, I guess you can use the medium voter literature, but he was asking, maybe it does some redistribution, but it should do much more, right? And he was saying, why does it not do much more than what it does, right? That was his question. So I think it's compatible with that. But he was saying, okay, in a country, when you ask people, why is democracy good? They say, because of social justice in many countries, right? So that's the expectation. And then when you look at what actually happens, it's far below the expectations. It may be compatible with the medium voter hypothesis, but the expectation of people go beyond that, right? And so the question was, why is it like that? And he explains that the fiscal capacity of the state is limited by a certain set of factors, the possibility for rich people to emigrate or other kind of constraints. There's a whole set of like maybe 15 constraints he discusses, such that he tries and explain that these converge towards making it very difficult for a state to go as far as you would expect. That would be the short answer. And the other one is, of course, what philosophers are always interested in is the hypothesis of the benevolent despot. Right? You could say, okay, we want a benevolent despot. Would that not be as good, right? And there are different ways in which you can answer that. One way could consist in saying maybe distributively the policies could be better in some cases, but certainly in one dimension of fairness, namely the fair allocation of power, we would have a violation of what we should expect from fairness. Right? Another way of answering consistency saying, yes, sometimes you have a benevolent despot, but very often they don't remain benevolent very long, and so it's a very risky policy to go for benevolent despots. It's much safer to go for democracy because you have the guarantee that if things go badly, you can change the government. That's what happens in some countries. Let's go and enjoy the rain.
Okay, well, discussions brief. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.